Hello, I'm Nicholas Bianco, Acting Director of the U.S. Climate Initiative at the World Resources Institute. Thank you for joining today's webinar on renewable natural gas and its use as climate strategy. For those of you that are new to WRI, we're a nonprofit, nonpartisan global research organization that spans more than 50 countries with offices in the United States, China, India, Brazil, Indonesia, and more. Our more than 700 experts and staff work closely with leaders in government and the private sector to turn big ideas into action and to sustain our natural resources while supporting economic development. And we're glad that you're able to join us today. As many of you know, the United States generates nearly 80 million tons of food scraps and other organic waste each year. Some of this waste is used for energy, but most of it piles up in landfills, is incinerated, or otherwise goes unused. Much of this waste releases methane into the atmosphere, a greenhouse gas that, on a per unit basis, contributes far more to global warming than carbon dioxide, with a global warming potential nearly 28 times as great. So renewable natural gas provides an opportunity to reduce those emissions while powering local economies. For this reason, we're beginning to see more states, cities, towns, and businesses across the US consider the benefits of turning this waste into fuel. While there's not a single commonly used definition for renewable natural gas, today, we're using this term to refer to biogas from the anaerobic digestion of wet organic waste that has been processed into essentially pure methane, and which can be used interchangeably with conventional natural gas in all of its end uses. And so as organizations and governments looking at the possible role of renewable natural gas and what it can play in helping to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, they're frequently asking themselves three basic questions. How much opportunity is there? Where is it? What does it cost? And how can they harness the largest possible GHG reductions from its use? So to help us answer these questions, we brought together three fantastic panelists, including Anelia Milbrandt, who is a senior analyst in bioenergy at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. Anelia has more than a decade of experience working on bioenergy and is a leading expert on wet waste to energy production and resource potential in the United States. We're so pleased that she's able to join us today to preview some of the new work she's been leading on the resource potential of waste available to make RNG and the cost of these resources. Please note that this work is under embargo as the report has not yet been finalized, and so if you have questions about the use of her findings, please contact her after the presentation. Our second panelist is WRI's Rebecca Gasper, who's a research associate with us. Rebecca is the lead author of our new publication just out today that explores how renewable natural gas can reduce greenhouse gas emissions. This work was supported by the generous financial contribution from UPS Foundation, and we invite you to explore this new publication and the blog that breaks down the research on wri.org/climate. And our third and final panelist today is Patrick Brown, the Director of Global Sustainability at UPS. UPS has secured some of the largest contracts for renewable natural gas in the shipping industry and is shaping the growth of these markets around the country. Patrick has been a great partner to us over the last 2 years, and we're very appreciative that he's able to join us today to share his valuable experience with procuring and using renewable natural gas and describe the role it plays in UPS's greenhouse gas and sustainability goals. So before we get started, one other note. Because we have a very high volume of participants today, which we're very excited about, we're going to be taking all questions in writing. So please feel free to submit questions in the question submission box at the bottom of the GoToWebinar platform as you think of them. Or if that's not an option available to you now, please email them to Yelena at Yelena, Y-E-L-E-N-A, .AKOPIAN@WRI.org, and we'll address as many of them as possible in the Q&A session after the presentations. So with that, let me turn you all over to Anelia to get us started. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. And thanks everyone for taking the time to join us today. It is my pleasure to participate and share with you our research related to renewable natural gas sources. I don't really see the slides, please. Moving.
Anelia, do you see the second slide?
No, but I will go off my deck, I suppose. I'm not sure what happened here. Thank you. RNG sources referred to as wet waste to energy resources here and include animal manure. Oh, perfect. Thank you. And include animal manure, fats, oils, and greases, such as animal fats, and namely inedible tallow, choice white grease, poultry fat, and so forth. Yellow grease, such as filtered and which is actually filtered and rendered used cooking oil. Brown grease, which is filtered or purified. Trap grease collected from food processing facilities. These sources also include sewage sludge, which is essentially untreated solids that remain after wastewater processing. These sources also include food waste, which is the leftover material at food processing establishments. Food waste generally comes from four primary sources: industrial, such as food manufacturing and wholesalers; institutional, think of schools, hospitals, hotels, correctional facilities; commercial sources, namely supermarkets and restaurants; and residential, namely private entities. These materials are used to produce biogas and, in extension, renewable natural gas. They also combusted, but lately they've been also of interest to more advanced waste-to-energy technologies, such as hydrothermal liquefaction. As a reference, hydrothermal liquefaction, or HTL for short, is a thermochemical conversion process that uses such wet biomass resources and produces crude-like oil, which we often refer to as bio-oil or bio-crude. I would like to make a note here that we consider waste to energy a broader term than incineration, and that includes also anaerobic digestion, gasification, pyrolysis, HCl, and other processes. Next slide, please. Thank you. This slide illustrates the geographic distribution of RNG sources. Maps are developed for all sources. This is just an example for select few, namely food waste on your on the left-hand side, sludge and dairy manure. For most resources, data was developed on site, which is critical for detailed feasibility evaluations, with the exception of food waste, for which the quantity was estimated at county level, as you can see again on the map on the left. The main takeaway from these maps is that the geographic distribution for most resources follows population dynamics. Places with higher population concentration are naturally sources of large quantity of waste. This is applicable to food waste, sludge, yellow and brown grease, which are not shown on this slide. But while the other resources, beef and swine manure, again not shown here, are fairly concentrated in the central states, while dairy manure and animal fats are relatively spread out. More information on this work will be available in a forthcoming publication. Next slide, please. We estimate that wet waste energy resources have the equivalent energy content of about 1 quad or 7 billion diesel gallon equivalent per year. Please note that this estimate is based on energy content alone and does not account for conversion efficiencies or losses during a particular conversion process. This resource potential accounts for about 18% of U.S. on-highway diesel consumption in 2016, namely freight transportation. Diesel is also used in other sectors such as railroad, farm equipment, and other off-road applications, but this number applies to on-highway diesel consumption only. Less than 2% of the estimated resource potential is currently used for RNG production, as shown in the graph here, which illustrates the RNG production during the past 7 years. The sharp increase in RNG production in 2014 is due to biogas pathways qualifying as advanced and cellulosic biofuel under RFS, namely D3 and D5 RIN credits, which trade at much higher market values than other type of RINs. Next slide, please. Thank you. With respect to RNG feedstock prices, we developed a model that generates what we call supply curves by state, and the supply curve is a function of resource quantity and resource cost. The model also maps the resource prices by county or on location. The model input include parameters such as resource quantity, collection costs if it's applicable, processing costs such as dewatering and storage, namely applicable to sewage sludge and manure, depackaging, which is more applicable to food waste. We also consider disposal costs and method. In the cost specifically, we include the landfill tipping fees and so forth. Some of the highlights for this ongoing, almost completed work is that wet waste to energy feedstocks exhibit different prices across geographic area. This again is no surprise, as there are a lot of variances in labor cost, fuel cost, and so forth between different markets. Feedstock can be treated as commodities or waste depending on location and markets. For example, most fat oils and greases are treated as commodity. Manure could also be a commodity in certain areas, namely used as fertilizer, while sludge and food waste, for the most part, are considered waste material. For example, almost 60% of food waste ends up in landfills in the U.S. If treated as waste, the feedstock price is controlled by the cost of its disposal, and if the waste has been commoditized, its price is determined by market demand. Next slide, please. Thank you. This slide illustrates two examples of the geographic variability in food waste prices. Non-residential, which is the sort of top left map, and residential food waste prices, which is the bottom map. Price of food waste is variable across the U.S. as a function of regional economics and policy. In the case of non-residential food waste prices, states with organic waste bans exhibit the lowest or negative feedstock cost. These areas are colored in navy blue and purple on this map. As you can see, California falls in that category, for the most part, Oregon and some states in the East Coast. Negative costs could also be due to tipping fees that are greater than the cost of collection and depackaging. Just as a reference, areas in dark pink or orange are generally areas with high landfill tipping fees, which are considered avoided costs in our scenario and therefore lower the feedstock cost. And the areas in yellow are generally areas with high collection cost. In the case of residential food waste, prices depend on collection radius and landfill tipping fees. Prices are lower in areas with high tipping fees and higher in rural areas where the collection cost is also high. Trucks need to go and make a lot more stops in more rural areas and need to go much further to collect those materials. I should note that this analysis does not account yet for food waste collection programs that have been developed in many cities and municipalities across the country. I believe a Biocycle magazine recent survey indicated that over 300 or so communities actually have this type of organic food waste collection, organics and food waste specific collection programs. These organics collection programs aggregate food waste from its point sources. Therefore, the feedstock is already separated, which avoids additional cost and keeps the prices low. Again, more information on this work will be available in a forthcoming publication. Next slide, please. Here I would like to acknowledge staff from Department of Energy, Bioenergy Technology Office, and AS&T for their guidance and support of this work, as well as my team here at NREL and colleagues at our sister laboratory, Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. They've been absolutely instrumental in all of these analysis and model results that they just show you. Thank you very much for your time.
Great, thank you so much, Amelia, for sharing this exciting new work with us. We at WRI have been struck by the energy potential of wet waste and how much is going unused. And we wondered whether RNG could provide a way for states, cities, and towns to capture more of that 7 billion gallons of diesel energy equivalent while reducing GHG emissions in the process. So for the next 15 minutes, I'll talk about WRI's work and the key findings of our new working paper, which looks at how RNG vehicle fuel can play a role in both public and private sector climate strategies. And this paper summarizes an analysis we've conducted over the past 2 years, which included a synthesis of existing data and literature and consultations with experts from government, academia, industry, and other research organizations. And before diving in, I'd like to acknowledge again the UPS Foundation for their financial support of this work, and Tim Searchinger, Senior Fellow at WRI, who co-authored this paper. And just to give a bit more context on why we're looking at vehicle fuel specifically, even though RNG production for vehicle fuel is relatively small in the US, it's growing rapidly, as Anelia mentioned. Production of RNG under the Renewable Fuel Standard grew 7 times in just 3 years to nearly 250 million gallons at the end of 2017. And this growth has been driven largely by the Renewable Fuel Standard and by state low carbon fuel standards in California and Oregon. As Anelia mentioned, credits under these programs can be worth much more than the gas itself. They're allowing producers to recoup the upfront investment in RNG production relatively quickly in some cases. Other factors are enabling RNG production as well, including other federal and state policies. So in California, for example, RNG is part of the state's plan to reduce methane emissions 40 to 45% by 2030, and part of its climate goals more broadly. Federal and state tax incentives and financing options for anaerobic digesters are helping RNG projects get off the ground. Corporate sustainability goals are playing a role as companies like UPS and Waste Management are adding RNG as one low carbon fuel option to help meet their goals. And in some cases, RNG is viewed as a way to complement other local priorities like air quality regulations, or as Anelia mentioned, restrictions on organic waste disposal in landfills, which are becoming more common. And at the same time, more state and local governments, companies, and universities are committing to greenhouse gas reductions and looking for ways to take action on climate change. So WR wanted to assess RNG as an emerging strategy that these entities might consider to help put waste to use and meet their climate goals. So our paper looked at several questions, including the 3 listed here. How and under what conditions can RNG reduce GHG emissions compared to fossil fuels used in vehicles? Which RNG project types or feedstock types can achieve the largest reductions? And is RNG economically feasible in terms of its production costs, incentives, and payback periods anticipated by projects on the ground? So today I'll focus on key findings related to these 3 questions, but our paper also does cover additional topics, including more details on trends and market opportunities. So these are our 3 key findings, and I'll talk about each one in more detail. First, RNG can significantly reduce emissions compared to fossil fuels when it meets the 2 conditions listed here. It's made from waste, and its production captures methane that would otherwise be emitted to the atmosphere. Second, RNG made from food and yard waste and manure projects in particular can deliver the largest reductions. And third, RNG projects are economically feasible from what we've seen so far on the ground. In some cases, they're cost effective in 5 years or fewer, but barriers do exist that might inhibit more widespread production. So how can RNG reduce emissions? One of the biggest potential climate benefits of RNG is that its production in some cases can prevent emissions of methane. As Nicholas said, methane has 28 times the global warming potential of carbon dioxide. And the wet organic waste sources that Anelia described in her presentation contribute about 30% of all US methane emissions as they decompose in their typical management. And that's represented by the organic waste category on the bar portion of the chart here, which includes methane emissions from landfills, livestock manure management, and wastewater treatment. When wet waste are used to make RNG instead, those methane emissions can be captured and used as an energy source, and we'll go into how that happens on the next couple slides. So this diagram is going to have 2 parts. The first panel here represents emissions that would otherwise occur from waste managed in its usual way and can be avoided due to RNG production. And this might be food waste or sludge disposed in landfills, or livestock manure stored in an open lagoon as 2 examples. Next slide. This panel represents the RNG vehicle fuel supply chain where wet waste are used to produce RNG instead. So starting on the left, organic waste are collected and transported in some cases, placed in an anaerobic digester where they decompose. And as they break down, they produce biogas, which is a mix of methane, carbon dioxide, and some other trace components. This biogas is then refined into essentially pure methane, at which point it's commonly referred to as RNG. And I should also mention that anaerobic digestion also occurs in landfills when organic waste are disposed there. and that forms a type of biogas usually referred to as landfill gas. And a gas collection system can be installed at landfills to capture that gas, which can then be refined into RNG, just like biogas from a digester. And once biogas has been refined into methane, the product is nearly identical to conventional natural gas and can be used in the same ways. So as a vehicle fuel, it gets compressed or liquefied, transported by pipeline or truck, dispensed at fueling stations, and then it can be used in a vehicle with a natural gas engine. RNG is mostly used in heavy-duty vehicles, so the fuel being replaced or displaced by RNG is typically either conventional natural gas or diesel fuel. And there are 3 buckets of GHG emissions that occur throughout this life cycle. One is energy used to produce and transport the gas. Second, leaks of methane that can occur at any step in the supply chain, including from compressors and pipelines, fueling stations, and from the vehicle itself. And third, combustion of the fuel in the vehicle, which produces mainly carbon dioxide like conventional natural gas. So to figure out the life cycle GHG impact of RNG from any given project or pathway, you would add up all the emissions it generates over its life cycle from those 3 buckets, and you'd subtract avoided emissions from waste management and any other avoided sources of emissions. And when those avoided emissions are taken into account, RNG's life cycle carbon footprint can be much lower than conventional natural gas or diesel. Now, that might not always be the case. It depends on the specifics of any given pathway. But RNG is most likely to have a very low carbon footprint on a life cycle basis when it is made from waste and when it captures methane that would otherwise be released. So when RNG is made from waste rather than dedicated uses of land, for example, growing crops to make RNG, it avoids land use competition with food, timber production, and ecosystems, and the GHG emissions and loss of carbon storage opportunities that can go along with that. And paying close attention to the net effect on methane is important because in some contexts, new RNG projects could actually increase methane emissions. And for wet waste, this mainly comes into play if the methane being produced is already being captured and either used or flared as part of its management, which is the case at many landfills, for example. Flaring converts most of the methane to carbon dioxide before it enters the atmosphere. So if methane that would otherwise be flared is used for RNG instead, any leaks that occur from when the gas is produced to when it's combusted in the vehicle could actually be new additions of methane to the atmosphere. And that's also going to depend in part on which fossil fuel RNG is replacing. So RNG that's composed of new methane rather than methane that would otherwise be emitted does add some uncertainty into its climate impact. But when RNG meets these 2 conditions, there's more certainty in the relative carbon benefit it can provide, and actually its avoided emissions represented in the top panel here can entirely outweigh the emissions it generates across its life cycle represented in that bottom panel, meaning it can have a negative carbon footprint over its life cycle. So this slide shows which types of RNG projects can meet these conditions, and you'll see that most of the wet waste Anelia described could potentially meet them, but it depends on how they're managed. So generally this includes food scraps, yard trimmings, or other organic waste diverted from landfill disposal, livestock manure where methane is currently uncontrolled, sludge at wastewater treatment facilities that aren't already using anaerobic digestion to treat waste and then flaring or using the methane, and landfill gas at landfills that aren't capturing methane, or where developing a new RNG project could significantly increase the amount of methane that's collected. So landfill gas collection systems tend to be inefficient and allow 15 to 25% of the gas to escape. So if an RNG project provides incentive for a landfill operator to invest in new technology or new operations that can tighten up that efficiency, it could potentially lead to net methane emissions reductions. And of these 4 categories, RNG from food and yard waste diverted from landfills and livestock manure projects are especially promising in terms of the GHG reductions they can provide compared to fossil fuels and other alternative fuels. So this chart shows certified life cycle carbon intensities under California's low carbon fuel standard in terms of gram CO2 equivalent emitted per megajoule, which is the value on the horizontal axis. And the bars represent the range of carbon intensity pathways certified within each fuel category. And that dark vertical line is set at the carbon intensity of diesel fuel, just for reference. So any bars to the left of that are less carbon intensive than diesel. And you can see that RNG from dairy manure and food and yard waste, which are the labeled in blue, have the lowest carbon intensity of any alternative fuel under the program, including grid and solar electricity and including hydrogen from various pathways as well. And they both actually have negative estimated carbon intensities, which reflects the statement I made earlier that avoided emissions from making RNG from these wastes in this category actually outweigh the emissions from production and use. And I would just note that these estimates are based on a model with a number of underlying assumptions. and the carbon intensity that comes out of that model is sensitive to some of them. And so we try to compile those in our working paper. And just one last thing I'll mention on food waste is that using food waste for fuel can come after implementing other measures to reduce the amount of food that gets sent for disposal in the first place. And WRI is also doing a lot of work on this, and you can find that by looking for food loss and waste on our website. And we're seeing that RNG projects can be economically viable. They're up and running successfully at sites around the country. The organization Energy Vision has some really great project profiles. If you check out their website, I'm just going to give two examples. In Ohio, the city of Columbus partnered with a private fuel producer on a large digester project that takes food and beverage waste, fats, oil, and grease, and other wet waste from the region that would otherwise be incinerated or end up in landfills, and they use it to produce both electricity and renewable natural gas. And that project has an expected payback period of just 4 years. And Fair Oaks, Indiana has one of the largest on-farm dairy manure to RNG projects. That's what's pictured here. RNG is part of the owner's vision to operate the farm with a zero carbon footprint. So they partner with a fuel producer to make RNG from their dairy cow manure, and then they use it to fuel the trucks that transport their milk to surrounding states. And they also use a solid byproduct of anaerobic digestion to make fertilizer for the farm. So this is a closed loop type of model that's typical of many RNG projects. And the cost of that project were reported at $18.5 million with an estimated payback period of about 10 years. So we're seeing some really exciting examples like this, but challenges do remain that could inhibit RNG production from scaling up, including in those two more promising segments that we mentioned. So upfront costs and financing can be difficult. I just gave an example of capital costs of nearly $20 million, and that's not unusual. There's not a lot of data on this, but capital cost estimates range from the millions to tens of millions of dollars. And total production costs can be anywhere from $3 to $30 per MMBTU. And that's what's shown here on this chart, which compiles production costs from 4 recent studies. And the leftmost column that's labeled all sources shows data for all wet waste RNG projects. So costs in this range can make it difficult for RNG to compete with cheap conventional natural gas, which is averaged around $3 per MMBTU, represented by that dashed line. And these cost estimates don't include incentives, which can be quite high. So the box here shows the value on a per MMBTU basis of the renewable fuel standard, which has been around $20, and from the low carbon fuel standard, which is up to $45. So clearly these incentives can help offset those production costs, but the revenue from selling credits in these markets can't generally be used to secure financing, so it doesn't really help with the issue of upfront costs. Another challenge that has been well documented in other research on RNG is pipeline injection, which can present both financial and logistical hurdles for some projects. So in many existing projects, the RNG producers or managers of the waste also use some or all of the fuel themselves, or they may have an offtake agreement with a local partner. But sometimes there's not enough local demand to use all of the RNG from a given project, and so in those cases, the producer will need to inject some of that gas into the natural gas pipeline. And this adds another layer of costs and introduces logistical challenges of negotiating with pipeline owners, navigating interconnection specifications, which can vary quite a bit around the country, and figuring out who funds those investments and how. And California is pioneering an incentive program now that makes funds available for dairy projects to connect to the pipeline. So it'll be interesting to see how that might work and whether it can serve as a model for other states. So our bottom line takeaway is that RNG that does meet the conditions we laid out could have a promising role in public or private sector strategies, particularly for cities and towns that have waste they need to manage, or companies with large vehicle fleets like UPS, who we'll hear from next. Especially in the near term, RNG can reduce emissions from multiple sectors, especially from waste management, but potentially from heavy duty transport as well, while meeting other environmental and social goals like more efficient waste management or reducing the amount of organic waste that ends up in landfills. But RNG's impacts and its costs are highly context specific, and GHG emissions are going to depend in part on what type of waste is being used and how that would have otherwise been managed. And of course, management practices shift over time. So those interested in pursuing RNG might consider focusing on projects that meet those two conditions, and in any case should do their own assessment of new projects or policies and not assume that RNG will lead to large emissions reductions in every case or indefinitely into the future. And our paper gives a bit more detail on what elements that type of assessment might include to ensure that RNG does result in reductions and achieves the largest reductions possible. So thank you all for your attention, and with that I'll turn it over to Patrick, who can tell us about how UPS is using RNG.
All right, well, thank you very much, Rebecca. Next slide. In order to understand UPS's approach to sustainability, it's helpful to start with a complete picture of what we do. When most people think of UPS, they think of our domestic and global package delivery, generally express letters, documents, small packages that weigh up to 150 pounds. But our business also encompasses our supply chain and freight services, which include forwarding, logistics, and distribution services, as well as the movement of freight over 150 pounds. It's also important to appreciate the scale of our business. Every day, we serve 1.5 million shipping customers, we deliver to 9 million receivers, and handle on average 20 million pieces every day. That adds up to 5.1 billion packages a year. Scale usually drives efficiency, and efficiency almost always delivers a sustainable benefit. That's why we believe sustainability is so inherent to UPS's business operations and strategy. Next slide. Recently, we set some new enterprise-wide goals that will help bolster the long-term resilience of our fuel supply chain and reduce our dependence on conventional petroleum-based energy sources. Our most ambitious goal is to reduce absolute greenhouse gas emissions by 12% throughout our global ground operations by 2025. This means that even as our business grows and delivery volume increases, our overall emissions need to decrease. Every day, we drive trucks and fly planes. As from the previous slide you saw, we have over 100,000 trucks on the road every day around the world. So the use of renewable energy is critical to reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. As a result, we've established 3 targets to spur the use of renewable energy sources throughout our operations and help us achieve the 12% reduction in absolute greenhouse gas emissions. One of those goals is that by 2025, we plan to source 40% of all of our ground fuel from sources other than gasoline or diesel. And of that 40%, renewable fuels are the key to achieving that absolute greenhouse gas reduction while continuing to grow our business. Next. As a leading global logistics company, we have a sense of responsibility to leverage our expertise, our scope, our scale, to explore and test the viability of new technologies. We do this by operating what we call our rolling laboratory. Through this rolling laboratory, we're able to evaluate a diverse range of existing and emerging technologies in real-world operating conditions. For more than 3 decades, we've been exploring the use of alternative fuel and advanced technology vehicles to conserve fuel and to reduce emissions. And because our global service area comprises of diverse terrains and delivery conditions, we can determine how these alternative fuels and advanced technologies perform in these real-world operating conditions. This diverse fleet of specialized vehicles drives more than 1 million miles each and every business day today. This real-time, on-the-road approach means that we can, 1, test new technologies and advancements on a commercial level scale, 2, work with our manufacturers to help them improve the vehicle performance, 3, adapt our findings to place the right type of vehicle in the right place, the right geography, and for maximum efficiency, and then 4, quickly deploy viable options at scale. Our fleet now comprises of 9,100 alternative fuel and advanced technology vehicles. These include compressed natural gas, liquid natural gas, propane, full electric, electric hybrid, hydraulic hybrid, and ethanol. But as mentioned earlier by Rebecca, the only viable alternative to the Class 8 diesel tractor today is natural gas. Next. Since 2009, UPS has invested more than $750 million in natural gas vehicles and fueling infrastructure. It's important to note that we make significant long-term investments that include a wide array of fuel types, that being nat gas, electric propane, traditional biofuels, and advanced synthetic fuels. We engage with suppliers and agencies at the federal, state, and local level to help try to remove those barriers and adopt some common sense approaches to really increase the adoption of these fuels. We're proving that there are alternatives to petroleum that actually work in real-world settings. And we are providing an alternative energy ecosystem that supports the commercialization of these alternative fuels at scale. And this specifically includes the use of RNG. In 2017, we used 77 million gallons of nat gas in our fleet. Of that 77 million gallons, 62 million gallons was brown fossil nat gas, and 15 million gallons of that was RNG, renewable natural gas. So you can see we still have opportunities. Late last year, we also announced an agreement with Big Ox Energy to purchase an additional 10 million gallons of RNG each year. So we're on projected in 2018 to be close to the 25 million gallons of RNG use in our fleet. Next. In order to support our expanding nat gas fleet, we continue to invest in refueling infrastructure. We at UPS build our own infrastructure to provide natural gas and fuel to our fleet. This slide highlights the status of our current fueling stations. We also have several other CNG fueling stations that are not depicted on this slide that will be coming online in 2018 and 2019. So quickly looking at this map of the U.S., the green dots are areas of where we have LNG fueling stations, and we deploy LNG Class 8 tractors. And there's 15 of them around the country. The orange dots are locations of CNG, compressed natural gas locations, 37 of them currently today. One thing to note is that our Class 8 tractor fleet here in the U.S., we have basically of the Class 8 tractor fleet, over 7 million miles each week is driven by natural gas tractors, and another 15 million is still driven by conventional diesel. So you can see that we're already over 1/3 of the miles and fuel used in our Class 8 fleet moving that towards nat gas. The shading on this, there's a red shade and a blue shade. The red shade is where we're using renewable diesel in our fleet. But more importantly is the blue shades, where we have approximately 20 fueling stations, 20 locations around the U.S. where we're using renewable natural gas in lieu of brown natural gas. I think the key takeaway here is, even though we've got more opportunity to go, I think that it's important that we don't overlook the importance of economies of scale when it comes to developing and using alternative fuels. At UPS, we reinforced our commitment to natural gas and the use of renewable fuels, and we have plans to continue to seek opportunities to purchase RNG over the next several years. As I mentioned on the previous slide, I've got 62 million gallons of opportunity here today. These types of commitments can spur market demand and provide a degree of certainty to suppliers that are contemplating these projects, especially during these times of economic certainty. As Rebecca mentioned in hers, a lot of times the hurdle is overcoming that initial cost, but we've invested so much in the infrastructure that we at UPS actually can provide an opportunity of being that source of that fuel. So with that, I'm going to hand it back over to you all, and we can open it up to questions.
Excellent. Thank you, Patrick. Thanks to all of our panelists today for their helpful presentations. We've received a number of questions already submitted to us through the chat option or through the question option on the webinar, and we encourage folks to continue submitting them as we go along. Since we have at this point received, I think, over a dozen questions, I'm going to try to consolidate a few of them and ask them of the group as a whole. So the first batch of comments that we've gotten thus far is a request for links to the resources. And what I can say here is we fully intend to make these resources available. The paper that Rebecca presented today is already online. A recording of this webinar will also be online on the WRI website at wri.org. The paper that Anelia presented, or the work that she presented, is preliminary and will be released in the near future on their website as well. The next set of questions we had were really, I think, ultimately clarification questions about renewable natural gas, questions around what exactly is it? What does it mean to be renewable in this context? Two, what do you need to actually do for vehicles to use it? Are there modifications that need to be made to the engines? Do you need different types of vehicles? Third, somewhat related is, vehicles are one use for renewable natural gas, but are there other uses like power generation? And how do you think about this use compared to some of those others? So with that, I think actually all three of our speakers have useful insights on any of these. So I'm not sure which of you wants to get started.
I can get started, and then Amelia and Patrick, please feel free to follow up. So just to clarify, I think the first question was on use of RNG in other applications. And so we do focus on vehicle fuel just because this is where most RNG is being used today. Estimates from the Coalition for Renewable Natural Gas, who kind of track this, estimate that about 3/4 of RNG is used for vehicle fuel, with the remaining use for power generation. But RNG can be used in any of the same applications as conventional natural gas, so that does include power and heat. And MJ Bradley actually recently released a study looking at RNG for commercial and residential heating applications as well. So we don't focus on vehicle fuel because we necessarily think it's the best end use, and we haven't really done a comparison of different end uses, but just because that's where most of it's being used today. And regarding its use in vehicle engines, yes, it has to be used in a vehicle with a natural gas engine. So as a fleet operator, the choice is really to, if you're using diesel, is to either retrofit or replace that vehicle with a natural gas engine. And studies that have been done recently have found that it's economical to make that transition, especially for vehicles that are logging a lot of miles, like freight haulers, waste management vehicles, and so forth. Was there another part to that question?
I think those are the core components.
Okay, Amelia or Patrick, do you have anything to add on that?
So
I think you covered it really well. Thank you.
Yeah, you did cover it very well. And so to the point, right? Any natural gas tractor or vehicle that is already equipped for regular, typical nat gas, whether it's CNG or LNG, can take the renewable natural gas and without any additional modifications. And we do use RNG in both our CNG tractors, and we actually use it also in our LNG tractors, where that RNG is then, basically put into liquid form.
Excellent. Thank you. The next question we have here is one that came in about the project viability. Specifically, is there a scale of project that is needed to help make projects pencil out to become economically attractive? And if so, how do you think about that?
So this is Rebecca. So from what I've seen in the research, yes, there are economies of scale that can be captured, but there are really a wide range of different scales of projects that are up and running on the ground, from really large digester projects that are connected to the pipeline to somewhat smaller scale projects that are fueling maybe dozens of local municipal vehicles or waste management vehicles. So I think it really is context specific.
Neil or Patrick, do you want to add anything to that?
I don't have anything for that one.
Great.
Neither me. Thank you.
So we also had some follow-up questions. Patrick, I know you touched on this a little bit, but maybe you can expand on your thinking and others can chime in too. What role do you all see for renewable natural gas powered vehicles versus electric vehicles, particularly given the significant price declines that we've seen in recent years?
Yeah, so I'll start with this one. So, I mean, today, with today's current technology, natural gas is the only viable alternative to diesel when it comes to a Class 8 tractor trailer. So it'll be, many years. I know Tesla's coming out with an electric tractor soon, but it'll be many years before electric, I think, gets that tipping point where you can purchase electricity and put in that infrastructure that will be at cost or below cost of a current diesel tractor. Nat gas is there today, right? We can make the investment in the tractors, in the fueling infrastructure, and do that at a cost that has a very attractive ROI as opposed to typical diesel. So, we see nat gas as the fuel, especially over at least for the next several years before the technology of batteries and electricity gets there.
Thanks, Patrick. And I would also just stress that also the emissions reduction potential is there as well. So, these are methane emissions that we have to deal with now. Cities and towns have waste that they have to deal with. And so turning that methane into vehicle fuel that we can use can result in emissions reductions today. And, looking at the chart of the life cycle carbon intensities that I showed, given where the grid is at, renewable natural gas can offer, some of the lowest carbon intensity fuel even compared to electricity today. Now, of course, it's going to clean up in the future as we move forward, but we think that there's still a great opportunity to capture those emissions reductions today.
Great. We also have a comment here requesting that we talk a little bit about the life cycle emissions or the full greenhouse gas emissions impact of methane, and how do we think about that, particularly as a short-lived climate pollutant with higher near-term impacts. What does that mean for this sort of analysis, and how people should think about the use of it for these purposes?
That's a great question. Thank you. So yes, methane is a short-lived climate pollutant, and it is essential that we reduce methane emissions in addition to carbon dioxide emissions to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. And so for simplicity's sake in this presentation, we referred to the global warming potential of methane as 28 times that of carbon dioxide. Now that's over 100 years. And that's typically used in life cycle analysis of RNG, and it's typically used in other reporting on greenhouse gas emissions. But given how potent methane is and given how important it is to reduce methane emissions, some organizations are using global warming potentials over a shorter time period of 20 years, and that's 86 times the global warming potential of carbon dioxide over that short of a time period. And so in the paper, we go into a little bit more detail on, whether those entities who are using RNG for a climate strategy might want to consider not just using 28, but maybe doing a sensitivity analysis and looking at the global warming potential of methane over shorter time periods. Also, our colleagues at the Environmental Defense Fund have published work looking at global warming potential in a slightly different way, looking at it as a continuum rather than just over a specified time period, 20 years or 100 years. And that might be useful information for those who are looking at this as well. And we do also point out in life cycle analysis that has been done for California and other analysis of RNG, it's typically is that 20-year global warming potential that's used. And so the choice of global warming potential is just one of several assumptions that can have a big influence on the life cycle carbon intensity that comes out. So if you use a greater global warming potential for methane, you would see that those RNG projects that have negative carbon intensities, those that are reducing methane, might have even greater benefits, whereas those projects that might be leading to a net increase in methane emissions would have fewer carbon benefits.
Great. Thanks, Rebecca. Anyone want to add to that? So we also got, I think, an interesting question about what individual actors can do. So specifically, if you have, say, a mid-sized organization, or in this particular case, a small school of 5,000 students, what, if anything, can they do in order to help turn food waste into renewable natural gas that can be either used for transportation or electricity or other purposes?
I can take a stab here, Amelia. I mentioned community scale type of programs and so forth. I think from my perspective, it would be helpful perhaps to look at additional or close by locations that they also have small quantities and interested in similar applications. The more the better. Certainly look into opportunities to collaborate and sort of accumulate as much as you can in your area for purposes like that. I don't know if Rebecca or Patrick want to chime in, but certainly we've seen those across the country. Some of the, excuse me, an example from the AD area is some of those dedicated food waste facilities actually are not only generating material on site, but they also have material trucked to them. So there are certainly materials like that, but also you can mingle some of the resources. You don't have to also focus on your own. You can blend your material. You can, again, if there's a manure generator close by or some other materials, such as sewage sludge or fat oils and greases and so forth. In fact, it is better when the materials mingle and it's not just a single source from a methane generation perspective. So look around is what I'm trying to say and see if there's opportunities for increasing quantity.
And I'll just add to that. I'll just add to that one too. So, like for example, I mentioned our agreement with Big Ox Energy, which is a waste recycling provider up in the Midwest area, where they'll collect waste, whether it's from wastewater treatment plants, agriculture, or other food processing. So they do exactly what Amelia said. It was about collecting all different types of waste. And I think the key is just, again, trying to find one that's in your area, right? You have to look at the entire life cycle. It's not worth trucking or moving these things in large amount of miles where you're going to just create more emissions. So.
Exactly.
Thanks, Patrick and Amelia. Just one last note on that. I mentioned the organization Energy Vision, and they have a very specific guide. I think it's called the Community Guide for Renewable Natural Gas Vehicle Projects that actually goes through and lists questions that you might ask if you're interested in starting one of these projects. It's very useful.
Thank you all. So we got one more question I think we have time for, and that is, what impact, if any, would a carbon price have on the viability of renewable natural gas? What would it need to reach in order to really affect project viability and to see a significant increase in applications? Does anyone want to start? Very unpopular question. Okay, great. Well, I guess in that case, just looking at the time, we're more or less out of it. So I want to thank all of our listeners for joining, and I want to extend a warm thank you to all three of our presenters for taking the time to present their findings and their work with us today. Please, all of you, feel free to get in touch if you would like to get more information from the presenters. If you have follow-up questions, I know there's many more that we didn't have time to get to today, and I'm sure that they'd be happy to answer them. And please do feel free to visit our website, wri.org, where you can find the latest research that Rebecca presented, as well as a copy of this webinar later today. Thanks so much.